Investors are really looking for companies that have a pathway to an approved drug. So if I'm an early stage founder, I would probably be approaching the problem from looking at very much the lens of what drugs are out there now, where are the unmet medical needs, how do I get there from an idea to an approved drug, and having that sort of framework outlined is really important. Because the market shifted to more of like a product-focused lens, it's much harder to get funding.
Is the biotech investment model broken, or has something structurally shifted that scientists need to understand? Welcome back to part 2 with Michael Rome of Foresite Capital. In part 1, we opened the conversation on how investors evaluate early-stage therapeutics and what they are looking for. Now we go further into the realities of today's funding environment, what scientists underestimate about how investors think, and the signals that separate strong programs from the rest. Are you juggling the complexities of CMC development while trying to enjoy the beauty of biotech? Have you ever wondered if there's a way to simplify bioprocessing? Welcome to the Smart Biotech Scientist Podcast, where we're diving headfirst into the very challenges you face. We're breaking it down, demystifying the jargon, and giving you the keys to unlock your full potential. I'm your host, David Brohlman, and I get it. With 15 plus years in the biotech industry, I face the same challenges you do. There's a way to simplify and streamline so you can remove complexity, you can skip trials and errors, deliver without delay your groundbreaking therapy to clinics and market, and still enjoy every single step. Do you want to learn how industry experts and I did it? Grab a cup of coffee and your favorite notebook and pen. Now is the time to take your bioprocessing game to the next level. Let's smarten up biotech. I'd like to shift gear a bit and let's address the elephant in the room, because in the last couple of years, I've heard very often when I was speaking to biotech leaders, CMC leaders, the same thing. It has become very difficult to secure funding. So I'm really glad to be able to ask this question to an investor. What is your view on that? Is the current biotech investment model broken? Or if it's not broken, why has it changed, or what has changed?
Taking a step back and maybe asking, how did we get to this place right now where funding has become more difficult, particularly for novel concepts? I like to think about it again from a financial perspective. In 2020, when COVID occurred and the Fed ended up lowering interest rates effectively to zero, that led to a flood of money into risk assets, and particularly biotech during that time. And so we had never seen an era where all of a sudden the biotech industry saw this flood of capital into the sector. And it happened, as we all remember, very quickly when COVID was occurring in its earlier stages. And effectively, the Fed just injected a lot of money into the economy. All of a sudden, you had new money there. I think it's safe to say before 2020, we saw very gradual adjustment of financial markets to biotech. So just more money going in the sector over a slow amount of time. And that's particularly because clinical development and these things take longer than other product cycles. So we had, I would say, a very steady climb of money going into biotech. All of a sudden, we had this huge boom run in 2020. And then there were investors, even in areas that are non-biotech specialists, looking for places to put capital. And again, having that discipline that led up to that stage, there were just less companies during that time. And what you had happening was earlier stage companies, they could be just formed a year earlier that were doing concept like gene editing. Those companies all of a sudden had access to capital, and in a very fast manner. So in 2020, we just saw tons of new biotech companies get formed. And then we saw, I think it was a record year for companies going public. And you had companies going public that actually were preclinical. And that's highly unusual for IPOs in the biotech industry. So all this capital being accessed, and biotech was really booming, as you remember, in 2020 into 2021. And then all of a sudden, the music stopped. So we had kind of an unwind of what was going on in biotech. We had this inflation issue. The Fed started raising rates. And then you had the exact opposite happening, money going out of risk assets, and particularly biotech. And you had a lot of generalist investors leave the sector and then go on to other areas like tech or cryptocurrencies or AI. Those became more of an appeal for risk assets. And then you just had funding stop. You had public markets stop for biotechs. That dried up. There's always a lag, but then the earlier stage companies ended up not being able to access capital right from public markets. And so that led to the era that we're in now. We could talk about how those factors are changing. I think we're seeing some really good things going on in M&A. That I think will flow back to earlier stage companies and things getting funded. But because we had that rapid drawback of capital, that made it really hard for early stage biotech companies to access the funding they needed. And so we just went through essentially like a valley of death where it was really hard to get exits for earlier stage companies. And thus investors didn't want to bet on things that were, you could say, more on the risky side. And so you had less novel concepts get funded as a result of that capital cycle.
In this challenging situation or season we're in, what advice would you give a startup founder, especially an early stage startup founder, to make a strong case? And what perhaps do they underestimate when they approach an investor?
So because the way the market has adjusted during the time I was describing, it's become more product focused. So investors are really looking for companies that have a pathway to an approved drug. So if I'm an early stage founder, I would probably be approaching the problem from looking at very much the lens of what drugs are out there now, where are the unmet medical needs, how do I get there from an idea to an approved drug, and having that sort of framework outlined is really important. You can take the opposite spectrum. You say, we've seen these huge advances in gene editing, so I'm going to start a gene editing company. And if you come to talk to an investor and you're looking for capital, we might say, well, the area is really interesting, but we don't know how much money it's going to take to get to an approved drug. We don't see the pathway right now. And because the market shifted to more of like a product focused lens, it's much harder to get funding. But let's say you approach an investor with an idea and you say, hey, there's a large unmet medical need in IBD. And I'll just make up an example, but say you're looking at 2 approved mechanisms. You're looking at something like IL-23 or TNF alpha or TL1A, which is a newer mechanism. You could say, I'm going to make a tri-specific antibody that addresses all 3 of these different MOAs. And here's the pathway we're going to get to an approved drug. Here's the type of clinical trial we would run. Right? Having those various details thought through, even at an earlier stage, could be very beneficial to an investor for understanding value creation.
To what extent do you look at CMC expertise and manufacturing readiness when you're evaluating a company?
I would say it's much more important area to focus on for later stage companies. So when we're investing in a company that, let's say, is in phase 3 development, we would spend a lot of time understanding CMC and manufacturing to make sure there's no bottlenecks there. Because one of the biggest issues that we've seen across the portfolio is companies that had done a great job on the clinical studies. They have a pathway to an approved drug. The CMC isn't buttoned up yet. And we know that the FDA, especially recently, has been very focused on these issues. And we've seen CMC delays that could go outward to 2 years post-clinical data. And that can be very expensive for a company. They can have competition in other areas. So we would spend a lot of time understanding the readiness there. We have really good expertise internally. We have a number of members who have spent decades in the biotech industry, but we'll also rely on outside consultants to really help us understand a new area. If we're looking at an earlier stage company where it's more clinical risk, will the drug work or not, we're much less focused on CMC. And then if it's later stage, then we're going to be a lot more focused on the details there.
In the beginning of our conversation, Michael, you mentioned that, for instance, if you come across a proven entrepreneur or somebody you have worked with in the past, you are much more likely to invest because you know that this is a great leader or great manager. I'd be curious because you have seen a whole lot of different founders, leaders. What are some common mindsets or leadership traits you were generally impressed in and that lead to success?
So, look, biotech is really hard, right? So most biotech companies that are started are going to fail. And we, for some degree, we're looking at basic pattern recognition. Like, what do we see in CEOs that has worked in the past? And the thing I'll say there is there's many different paths to someone who's successful. So they could be CEO that has a certain personality trait. I mean, the one commonality is how different successful CEOs can be. And so we'll look for those various patterns. And you could have an individual running a company who they're very focused. And also they could be, this isn't always the case, but they could be very competitive. They have an area that they want to make the best molecule for, and they would work very quickly and focus to do so. And so we think those are great traits. And something I think isn't talked about enough but is really important is really execution and how good the team is at executing. And so we'll look for that ability in entrepreneur. And it helps to see if they've done it before. Have they built a biotech company? Have they executed in all the various functions? As we know, there's many different areas of biotech, whether it's CMC or clinical or preclinical or regulatory. So does that entrepreneur have a grasp over those areas, or do they have appropriate people and team to do so? So I wouldn't say that's a prerequisite investing in any company, but it does help to have the proven experience. Our industry is so different from the tech industry, right? You could have in the tech industry a CEO who like 22 years old. In the biotech industry, you need to be experienced, right? A lot of times you have advanced degrees. You need to spend a decade in the industry to really understand it. And so the nice thing is that we tend to interact with people who have been in the business and have a very mature framework for looking at things.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. You need a lot of expertise in our field. And yes, biotech is hard. Looking at the current landscape of technology, novel molecules, and also the funding challenges, what are the most promising areas you're investing in? And you would also perhaps suggest that startup would go after these areas or technologies?
One area that really excites me is what's going on in small molecule oncology right now, in particular, looking at modalities like degraders or heterobifunctional molecules. What is nice about that from an investor point of view is a lot of times you're not using those to target a novel mechanism, but you're using that in unique ways to target disease drivers that, let's say, traditional small molecules couldn't address. So I like this area a lot because not only is it somewhat de-risked from a biology point of view, but we now have proof of concept across a number of companies. You have companies who are experts in developing degraders. So we like the advances on the chemistry front. You know, when I was a graduate student 20 years ago, there were rules for medicinal chemistry. Like you had to follow the Lipinski rule of 5. And when you talk to chemists, they said, well, it's going to be possible to design heterobifunctional molecules that have triple the molecular weight, right? And they're going to have permeability issues, or they're going to have low bioavailability. And what's occurred now over the past 5 to 10 years is we've shown that we can make these types of molecules. And so you just have a number of companies now that are doing exciting biology. Take a company like Chimera that has a STAT6 degrader. STAT6 is a really hard target to drug, and a degrader makes a lot of sense there. So seeing that proof of concept is important. And then now you're seeing companies that are using those technologies to go after harder biological problems. So for instance, there was a company, Halda, that was acquired by J&J a few months ago. And what Halda had were these really interesting molecules called RIPTAC. And what RIPTACs do is they basically allow you to target, a lot of times, a known molecular driver of cancer, so to speak. The RIPTAC that Halda made was targeting the AR protein for prostate cancer. But then the other side of the RIPTAC, and you mentioned this is a heterobifunctional molecule, targets an essential cellular protein. And in that case, it targeted the BRD4 protein. And what was really groundbreaking about Halda's data was they showed they could use AR as a targeting moiety to destroy the entire cell. So even though the cell could have co-occurring driver mutations, just having that as a zip code, I think, was a very important proof of concept for the field. And so when I think about these next generation drugs, I think we're going to find things that not only target one protein, but really give you the ability to extrapolate what's going on the antibody drug conjugates, but more so for specific small molecules. The last thing I'll say there is, the technology that Revolution Medicines has developed is, again, another groundbreaking technology and enabling across many fields. So RevMed has a drug it's a pan-RAS inhibitor, and essentially the molecule binds both RAS and then forms a complex with cyclophilin. And so it uses essentially a ubiquitously expressed cellular protein to form a trapping mechanism with an oncogenic driver. So all of these use cases, whether it's degraders or whether it's the RIPTACs from Halda or using these cyclophilin molecules that RevMed is making, all of that's coming together now. And I think we're about to see a revolution of these types of concepts occur for not only oncology, but even other fields as well.
Let's get practical at this stage, Michael, and let's talk to the startup founder who is preparing the next funding round. What are 2-3 things they should start doing today?
I can actually relate a little bit here. So because we have an incubator, we're looking at concepts that aren't externally funded yet. So we're trying to think of things, quite frankly, like how would this look to an investor when we're going out for outside funding? So we are constantly thinking about this type of problem and how to create a company that would have appeal. And so I think it really goes back to that concept I talked about earlier with understanding the unmet medical need and the market really deeply before going on to a scientific topic. I think what I see sometimes are scientific founders who are brilliant in their fields, but haven't yet thought of the business case. And so they might say, we have this incredible technical ability to do X, Y, and Z. And then when you start talking to them, it isn't obvious what unmet medical need, or what market that would solve, right? So when we're thinking about starting a company, we take the opposite sort of approach. We look again at what are the market needs, how difficult are fields, what are the barriers of entry, really think about it from that angle first, and then work backwards to how we get to a solution. And so if I'm a new founder, or if I'm looking to pitch a VC, I would try to frame it in that framework very carefully, think about the different angles, and then describe the problem you're solving and how you're going to do it. That would be my advice to early stage founders.
Yeah, Smart Biotech Scientist, this is great advice. Start with the end in mind, understand what your customer needs, and then reverse engineering. As we are wrapping up, Michael, what additional questions should I have asked?
We covered a lot. We covered what was going on in China, the geopolitical issues. Maybe it might be fun to talk about what's going on in biotech today. Where is the industry headed? These types of things. We're obviously spending a lot of time thinking about this. One thing I think that's been really positive for biotech is all of the M&A that's been occurring over the last even 6 months now. This will have a lag effect to earlier stage companies, but having the later stage biotechs get acquired ends up drawing more dollars into the sector because frankly, investors have made money on those companies. So they'll end up deploying those dollars into earlier stage companies. So having gone through this M&A cycle, we're going to see dollars flow back more to earlier stage VCs, and you might even attract generalists you see in the space and say, hey, there's all this M&A going on. We have a pathway to making returns here. So this typically occurs in a lag. It can be anywhere from 6 months to a year. As we are going through this cycle, I think it's going to become healthier for biotech venture capital. I think it will help some of the issues we were talking about earlier that the industry faced. So I tend to think of things in cycles. We went through this cycle we talked about where we had a boom in biotech during COVID. We went through the cycle where we had kind of like a valley of death. And now I think we're in a new cycle where M&A is emerging. It's happening at a pace rather that is really quickly, and I think that'll be healthy for the sector. I would say it's not all rosy. When you think about what's going on at the FDA, there's a lot of chaos at FDA. We're now had Marty McCary resign yesterday. We've been through heads of various divisions. And so it would be nice to see some stability there. And I think that is one area we're worried about is how will that affect the biotech industry? I think the FDA is the best regulatory organization for biotech in the world. I mean, we have incredible career scientists that are there, individuals who are medical doctors and decided not to go into a profession that could be more lucrative, but want to do public good. And so I think there's just a lot of good people at FDA. It would be great to continue that culture, and just seeing more stability there is going to be good. So we're watching that really carefully. But positive M&A is really strong. So that's going to be underlying driver, I think, going forward. Hopefully it continues. I'm pretty excited. I think we're going to enter an era where we're going to have more dollars funding biotech companies.
This has been great, Michael. With all what we've discussed so far, what is the most important takeaway from our conversation?
I think what's important for me is we're talking to an audience here that is pretty specific in the biotech industry. It's good to think about relating what we do to more scientists, because I think the closer communication we have with these different sectors, I think benefits everybody. We can understand better from the scientists what are issues in CMC or manufacturing or development that we need to be thinking about. I tend to spend a lot of time with companies and going out for dinner or drinks with the CEOs, or rather the CSOs or various people who are doing the work at these companies. So I think it's always good to be educated on what's going on there. And so thinking about it through this framework, the way you're asking the questions is definitely helpful for me.
Yes, this is such a good point. It's very important to understand what other people are doing and communicate proactively and better in a way so we can collaborate better. where can people get a hold of you and learn more about your work and understand more about investment?
Sure thing. I think visiting our company website, foresitecapital.com. We also have a LinkedIn presence. We'll post various things that are happening at portfolio companies. So definitely go to LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn as well. Feel free to reach out, shoot me a message. Happy to connect live. And those are, I would say, the primary ways we can interact.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your insights, for opening perhaps also another perspective of what our audience is not so familiar with, the funding area. And Smart Biotech Scientist, there you have it. You have all the information in the show notes. Please reach out to Michael and his team. And once again, Michael, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, David. Really enjoyed the time and all the great questions.
That brings us to the end of this rare conversation from the investor's seat. Michael Rome shared candid perspectives on funding, on what separates winning teams, and on where he'd place his bets for the next decade. If this gave you a new lens on your own work, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite platform. Thank you so much for your review, for your comment, for providing feedback what you liked, and thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. All right, smart scientists. That's all for today on the Smart Biotech Scientist Podcast. Thank you for tuning in and joining us on your journey to bioprocess mastery. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. By doing so, we can empower more scientists like you. For additional bioprocessing tips, visit us at smartbiotechscientist.com. Stay tuned for more inspiring biotech insights in our next episode. Until then, let's continue to smarten up biotech.